I want to thank everyone for coming tonight to the Darien Library to see this terrific program with Kale Williams. I'd also like to thank the Darien Nature Center and Barrett Bookstore who participate with these programs. Barrett has the book on hand, so please stop by, get a copy. It makes a great holiday present. I also want to thank the friends of the library who underwrite these programs and make them possible. Let me tell you a little bit about Kale. Kale's book, The Loneliest Polar Bear, is a true story of survival and peril at the edge of the warming world. He is a reporter for the Oregonian and Oregon Live, where he covers science and the environment. A native of the Bay Area, he previously reported for the San Francisco Chronicle. He shares a home with his wife, Rebecca, his two dogs, Goose and Beans, his cat, Torta, and his stepcat, Lucas. Not too many people have a stepcat. So without further ado, we'll share a screen and Kale will kind of come up and start the program.
Wait for the screen to get up here, but while we do, I will just say hello to everybody. Thanks for coming out on the Thursday evening. I'm here in Portland, Oregon. I assume most of you are in Connecticut, but who knows with the world these days. As you can see from the screen, the book is called The Loneliest Polar Bear. I am Kale Williams. And the book in question, the bear in question is a bear named Nora. So that's Nora, and that's Nora at about the age of 10 months. That's when I met her. I was working then at the Oregonian, as I do now. I was a reporter working on various things, as Kathleen mentioned. Science and the environment fell within my purview. And when the Oregon Zoo here in Portland said that they were getting a new polar bear cub, we, of course, were interested. I mean, you can see just from looking at her why we would be interested. Polar bears are very cute. They're exotic animals that very few people get to see in real life outside of zoos. And so we went up and started asking questions like reporters do. And it turned out that Nora had a bit of a more interesting backstory than most zoo animals. She was born at a zoo in Columbus, Ohio, in November of 2015, and she was abandoned by her mother in the den after about 6 days. Polar bears usually spend 4 to 6 months in the den. They're born very small, almost completely helpless. And so we knew that there was a larger story here, and you'll be able to see just how small they are as we go to the next slide. So that's Nora's mother, Aurora, and that little blob that you see down there, that's Nora. She weighed about 600 grams when she was born, which is roughly the same size as a squirrel. They don't have any hair, their eyes are shut, they can't barely hear anything, and they have no way to regulate their own temperature. So when she was abandoned, the zookeepers had a very tough decision to make. They knew that their odds of raising her on their own were bad. Most polar bears who are hand raised by zookeepers don't survive. They have about a 50-50 chance. And so it was a tough decision, but they knew after a few hours that she wouldn't survive in there on her own. And so they made the decision to pull her out, and they began hand raising her. And so we knew that there was a bigger story here at the newspaper. And so we started kind of asking about what was the bigger story that we could tell, sort of using Nora as a vehicle. And so we started asking about her background and her parents' background. Her mother, Aurora, had been born in a zoo, and her mother's parents had also been born in a zoo. But her father, a bear named Nanook, had actually, we found out, been orphaned as a cub up in Alaska in 1988. We found that out by kind of tracing his path back through all the zoos that he had been at. He was 29 years old at that point. And we finally got to a zoo that said, I think the US Fish and Wildlife had something to do with how he was orphaned. So I called them up and they dug in their archives, and they dug up this release from 1988 saying that there had been a polar bear hunter from a native Alaskan village called Wales on the west coast of Alaska, who had gone out hunting and who had fallen into a polar bear den while he was climbing around on an iceberg, landed on top of the mother polar bear. She had attacked him and he had killed her in self-defense, only then to realize that there were 2 cubs in the den. He ended up rescuing both of those cubs. One of those would grow up and become Nanook. And so this is the guy who fell in the den at the time. His name is Gene Agnabugak. He still lives in Wales. And that was where we started to realize that there was a much bigger story here. This wasn't a story just about a bear in a zoo or just about bears in the wild. When I called Gene, it took me a while to track him down, but I found him and I called him and I started talking to him about what life is like in Wales. And I ended up going up there and talking to him and hearing the story about how he fell in this den. You can go to the next slide, Kathleen. Which actually got coverage in the local paper, the Nome Nugget. Some of you might be familiar with Nome. It's where the Iditarod finishes every year in Alaska. So these two bears got rescued from the den, flown to Nome, then to Anchorage, and they were split up. One of the bears, who was named Norton, ended up going to Indianapolis. Nanook went to a bunch of different places and ended up finally in Columbus, Ohio, where he fathered Nora. But to find all this out, I had to go up to Wales, and you can go to the next slide. And this is just a little travel video that we put together at the newspaper that kind of shows exactly where it is that we went. I went from Portland up to Anchorage to Nome, kind of the reverse of how Nanook and Norton traveled. And you can see there that Wales is right on the tip of the North American continent. It's about 50 miles from the Siberian coast. And it's a very, very small village. It's about 150 people, almost 100% Native Alaskan. And it's really only accessible by airplane or boat. It is not on the road system. That's me a little bit out of sorts arriving in Wales for the first time. It took me a little while to get our bearings. We ended up getting a ride from a very nice gentleman on a four-wheeler who took us to where we would be staying. You can go to the next slide. And that's when I ended up meeting Gene. We should see in just a second. So Gene grew up in Wales. I'll wait until the picture comes up, but he grew up in Wales and that's where he learned how to hunt. And basically he's lived there his whole life. He hasn't traveled far. And Wales is not an easy place to live. A lot of the folks who live there still rely on subsistence hunting to get by. They hunt polar bears when they're around, though they're around much less frequently these days. They hunt seals and walrus. They hunt moose and caribou. There we go. That's an overview of Wales. And you can see on the right of the screen there, that's all sea ice. The first time I visited was in March. And there's sort of a main street that you can see that goes up the middle of the left side there. And then Gene's house is way down on the south end. This is a drone picture that one of our photojournalists took looking south. So that's where Gene is from. That's where he still lives. And that's where Nora's story really originally began. We can go to the next slide. There's Gene in his home. We can go one more. And that's Nora when she arrived in Oregon. So about 6 or 7 months after she was born, and the zookeepers had, encountered some problems feeding her and getting her acclimated because she would normally be with her mother. They realized that they needed to make room in their polar bear habitat in Ohio because Aurora had been seen mating with Nanook again, and they thought she might be pregnant. There was no room for her. So Nora was moved to Portland, Oregon, and that's when I met her. One of the reasons that they moved her was because they needed the space in Ohio, but another reason was because out here in Portland, we had another bear named Tossel, who was much older. She was about the same age as Nanook, 28 or 29 at the time. And she had lived her whole life with her twin brother, Conrad, but Conrad had passed away a few months before, and so Tossel was all alone. They thought that Tossel would make a great mentor for Nora, but it took them some getting used to each other. And you can go to the next slide. There's another video of them soon after they met. That's Tossel wearing a research collar. We can go one more slide. And so when Nora and Tossel met, Nora was initially pretty frightened of Tossel. The video is a little choppy here, but Tossel chased Nora around, not in really a threatening way, more of a curious way. But Nora really didn't have any other experience with any polar bears. She had been able to see and hear and smell bears at the zoo in Ohio, but she had never really been in the same physical space as one. And she was not super keen on it. She was a little bit frightened, and she started showing some symptoms of anxiety and depression. And in animals, the way that that manifests is they will start doing these sort of repetitive actions, walking in circles and kind of throwing tantrums. We can go to the next slide. um, and so the keepers kind of called off the meetings between the two bears. Around that time, Tossel's health started to decline. Like I said, she was an older bear, and they discovered that she had ovarian cancer, and she was too old to do major surgery on, and so they made the sad decision to euthanize Tossel. And so that left Nora alone again. And at this point, some of Nora's mental health problems began to become a little more drastic. She was becoming very, very withdrawn, and the keepers there were concerned. They knew that she had very little experience with other bears. You can move on to the next slide. And that she wasn't being socialized. They had hoped that she would grow up to have a normal life, despite the fact that she had been raised by zookeepers. But it was looking more and more like that wasn't going to be possible. She was at this point nearing year and a half, 2 years old, and had very rarely been with any other bears. And so the zookeepers there came up with this idea to do these things called Zen sessions. One of the things that polar bears learn from their moms is patience, and basically what is worth getting all riled up over. In the wild, that helps them hunt. In zoos, that helps them become socialized to other bears. And so they started doing these things called Zen sessions, where they would call her over to this door, and they would start feeding her fish at regular intervals of 5 seconds every fish, and then they would lengthen it. It would be 6 seconds, and then 7 seconds, and then see how long she could go before she would start throwing a tantrum. That didn't necessarily do everything that they hoped it would, and they also put her on some prescriptions that are probably familiar to some people. She was on some antidepressants, Zoloft and fluoxetine. But between the two of those things, you can go to the next slide. She really showed a lot of progress, and this is Nora kind of showing some of that progress. One of the things that the keepers told me on multiple occasions, that she was just very much a people bear. She would get frustrated when she would come out and there weren't people there to look at her. When she was out and there were people there, she would spend a lot of her time up by the glass. But she really wasn't learning any of the things that most polar bears learn from their mothers. You can go to the next video. And so one of the things that is really important for polar bears to know, especially in the wild, is how to hunt. And to hunt, polar bears need sea ice. Typically what they do is they will go out on the sea ice and they will stalk seals, specifically at the breathing holes that seals carve in the ice. And they'll sometimes go and wait there for up to 24 hours for a seal to surface. And then that's how they get the nutrition that they need. Polar bears are large animals, the largest animals in the Arctic, largest land animals in the Arctic, I should say. And they need a lot of calories to support themselves. They have a thick layer of fat that keeps them warm. They're very active. They swim a ton. They're actually considered marine mammals, just like seals and walruses and whales. And without sea ice, it's almost impossible for them to hunt. In the places where sea ice recedes in the summer, they often will go for months without eating or be forced to forage for birds' nests or in trash heaps. And so as sea ice has diminished, as the Arctic has gotten warmer, it has gotten harder and harder for polar bears to hunt. But there are different ways to look at the polar bears who populate the Arctic. And you can go to the next slide, Kathleen. So around the Arctic, there are 19 different subpopulations of polar bears. And you can see there at the top, the Chukchi Sea. That's where Nora's ancestors came from. And the Chukchi sea bears are actually not faring that poorly right now. And there's a couple different reasons for that. There's a big, shallow continental shelf that stretches out into the Bering and Chukchi Sea right off Alaska. And it's a very productive area biologically. There's lots of seals, there's lots of fish, there's a lot of life there. But if you look at the next subpopulation over, the one that says SB, that's the Southern Barents Sea population. And those bears are not doing as well. There's a very pronounced drop off of the continental shelf right off the north coast of Alaska. And so as the sea ice recedes, they either have to make a choice where they follow the sea ice farther and farther into the Arctic Ocean, or they stay on land, and most of them stay on land. And so as sea ice has gotten more scarce there, those bears have seen pretty precipitous declines. Their population has gone up and gone down, but the lack of sea ice has definitely impacted them. And you can go to the next slide. And that same phenomenon, the lack of sea ice, has been affecting the ability of the hunters in whales. This is a picture of the shell of what was one of the last skin boats that they used in Alaska. Gene told me that this was his father's boat. And as you can see, it's a wooden frame here, and they would stretch walrus skins over it. They don't use these types of boats much anymore. They now have, aluminum boats with outboard motors. And so while they've kind of adapted and adopted modern technology for hunting, they still need sea ice. There's no way around that. And as that has gone south and gotten smaller and fewer and farther between, it's gotten a lot harder for them. They say that the weather used to be incredibly predictable up there. You would get these calm periods that would last for 2 weeks, and now they'll have what looks like a calm day, and then within hours a crazy storm will roll in and it'll be too dangerous to go out on the water, or the icebergs will flow down the Bering Sea into the strait and then flow out and then in and then out, so they never really know exactly what they're working with. You can move on to the next slide. Another guy, that's Gene heading into his house. You can go to the next one. Another guy that I met up there named Gilbert Oxerock. He's one of the most respected elders in the village and one of the best hunters, from what he told me. And he says that it's gotten a lot harder to teach the younger generations how to hunt because there are so many fewer days for them to actually get out on the ice for all of the reasons I just described. And that's really something that was troubling for him. I mean, he learned how to hunt from his aunts and uncles, his grandparents, and it's been like that for hundreds and hundreds of years there. But it's getting a lot harder to do that. And so he's afraid that this tradition that they've had, this culture that a lot of their way of life is based upon, is really kind of falling away from them, and they're not sure exactly what to do it. You can move to the next slide. That's Gilbert. He's really quite an entertaining guy who likes nothing more than to make fun of naive white reporters with dumb questions who come to his village. And so it was an interesting time up there. I actually ended up traveling to Wales on 3 different occasions. It's very remote, and their way of life there is much different than probably what most of us are used to. There is no plumbing in the village. They use honey pots. There's two stores in the village, and they're outrageously expensive just because of how hard it is to get stuff there. When I flew on that little plane in the video at the beginning of this talk, I was sitting next to a pallet that was filled with top ramen and ketchup and tin foil and all those types of things. But you go to the store and a bag of sugar costs $20, and a roll of tin foil is 15, and gas is $10 a gallon, just because it's so hard to get to. And so that kind of underscored how problematic it is that it's getting so much harder to hunt for them. I mean, subsistence hunting makes up probably between 30 and 50% of their diet at this point. It's not everything that they eat, but it's by far the healthiest stuff because it's hard to deliver fresh produce. to a tiny remote Alaskan village, if not impossible. And so a lot of stuff that's there is full of preservatives, and they've gotten so used to eating their traditional foods that that's all that they need. It's just getting a lot harder to get. And so talking to the folks up there was what really showed me that, Nora's story back in the zoo in Oregon was really tied to the way that people still live up in the Arctic. I mean, both polar bears and the hunters up there have adapted to a way of life over thousands of years that is becoming unsustainable for them. And it's becoming unsustainable for them largely due to no fault of their own. I mean, they use outboard motors and they consume fossil fuels, but not nearly to the extent, the people up there, not the polar bears, of course, not nearly to the extent that any of us do down here in the lower 48. So that's what really tied it together for me. And that's when I really started to see how the plight of polar bears and the plight of people up there were really tied together. We can go to the next slide. There's the gun rack that hangs in Gilbert's entryway. You can go one more slide. And this is Gene. This was, I think we don't have the ability to play sound here, but this is Gene and I. You can probably tell that it was very cold. I think with wind chill, when I was there, it was about 25 or 30 below that first time. Like I said, that was in March, which is one of the coldest times up there. But I went back there again in March 2 years later, and it was warm enough that it was raining there. And obviously one season is not indicative of overall climate trends, but it was pretty striking for me that, I could be there at the same time of year, 2 years apart. One year it's 30 degrees below zero, and the next year, 2 years later, it's 30 degrees above. We can go to the next slide. So getting back to Nora, she was again alone in Oregon and, had been without a companion for a long time. And so they sent her off to Utah because there was another bear there, a bear named Hope, that was actually kind of distantly related to Nora. They were, Hope was technically Nora's aunt, had been born to Nora's grandmother on her mother's side in another zoo in Ohio. It's a little bit complicated, but they were distantly related. And so they hoped that the zookeepers hoped that the two of them would get along. They were about the same age. And so they were both brought to the zoo in Utah. It took probably 6 or 8 weeks of them getting used to each other. But as you can see from the photo here, they ended up being pretty good friends. Well, not friends, I don't want to anthropomorphize, but they ended up getting along really well. They would play fight. Apparently Nora would sneak up behind Hope and sometimes bite her on the rear end while they were swimming in the pool. But eventually Nora had another setback. They don't really know how it happened, but sometime in December of 2019, the zookeepers came in and found Nora unwilling to move in her den. And they ended up getting her back behind the scenes, and they anesthetized her and took some x-rays. And she'd actually broken her humerus, one of the large weight-bearing bones in one of her front legs. They ended up doing a first of its kind surgery. They brought in a specialized team of surgeons from the University of Texas A&M, a guy who kind of pioneered the surgery of inserting rods into the broken bones of young horses. And he had never done the surgery on a polar bear, but he was willing to give it a try. And so about a week and a half after she broke her leg, she went into surgery and they put a rod and a bunch of screws into her leg, and it was successful. She spent about 6 to 9 months in physical therapy, where they had to keep her in a small pen in the back, sort of limiting her movement, and then slowly training her to increase her range of motion and put more weight on the leg. But one of the most endearing stories that I heard about these two bears, Nora and Hope, came during that time. Sometimes when the keepers would come in the morning and Nora was in this back pen separate from Hope, they would find the two of them sleeping on the same side of a door, on either side of a door, because they wanted to be as close to each other as possible. That's sort of what led me to say that they were friends. But as is the case with zoo animals, they get moved around a lot. You can go to the next slide. And earlier this year, Nora was brought back to the Oregon Zoo, where they just finished construction on this brand new, very fancy polar bear habitat. And she's there now. She has been here for about 5 or 6 months. And just last month, they brought in another bear, a bear named Amelia Gray. You can move on to the next slide. There's Nora currently at her home here in Portland. They brought in another bear named Amelia Gray, who was also born at the zoo in Ohio. Amelia Gray was not born to Aurora, but was fathered by Nanook, so they are half siblings. The zookeepers tell me that doesn't necessarily mean they'll get along any better, but they are, again, related. It's a small family of zoo bears. And the two of them, after some initial trepidation, ended up getting along almost as well as Nora and Hope. I think we've got 1 or 2 more slides if you want to go to the next one. And there is Nora. I apologize that I don't have any pictures of Nora and Amelia Gray playing together, but that's where she is now. And like I said before, I mean, this whole story, to me, it is about Nora, and she is a very compelling main character. But for me, it's about the human relationship to the natural world, and the way that, you know, our actions, however small they may seem on a day-to-day scale, are impacting these much larger natural systems. You know, the way sea ice forms, the way storms form in the Gulf of Mexico and become very intense, wildfires and droughts. And how those changes are impacting, first and foremost, people who are most vulnerable, people who sort of already exist on the margins, people like Jean, who live in Wales, or people who are unable to evacuate a hurricane on the Gulf Coast, or who, you know, are already, you know, living paycheck to paycheck and then lose their home in a fire here in Oregon. Or a hurricane that comes up the East Coast towards New York or Connecticut. And so that's really what hit home for me. You know, it's easy for us to ignore the impact that our everyday actions have on the natural world. We're pretty insulated from it, but lots of people aren't. And so for those of us who have the privilege of, you know, not necessarily seeing those changes that our actions cause, you know, I hope that the book, you know, hammers home that nothing exists in a vacuum and that everything is connected. And I'd be happy to take any questions that any of you have.
All right. Well, I'm sorry for those technical difficulties, but we do have some questions. Can everyone hear us?
We made it through.
Yeah, thank you. Our new Zoom room has a few kinks, but you're a good
Yeah.
trooper, and thank you so much. And I forgot to hold the book up before, and this has one of the library covers on it, but it really does make a great holiday gift, and it's not sad, it's just important, and it's just a good read. Someone asked, in the book, it mentions that the zoo made a video of Nora, and someone wanted to know, is that video still available and where can they get it?
Yes, so there are many videos of Nora available. One thing I touch on the book, but didn't really talk about here, is she became really a social media star. I mean, people very rarely get to see any images of polar bears at that age. When they're born in zoos, most of the time they're in the den undisturbed until they're 5 or 6 months old. So to see a polar bear that's small enough to hold in your hand and hand feed, the zoo really took advantage of that and put out a lot of videos. So if you go to the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium's YouTube page and scroll back to 2016, there's lots of videos there. We actually made a 30-minute documentary at the Oregonian that includes a lot of those videos that you can find on our YouTube page. It's called Into Thin Ice. And then when she was here in Oregon, the zoo put out tons of videos. in Utah. They did a lot of Facebook Lives from her enclosure, talking to her keepers about all the different things she was going to. So if you want to see videos of when she's a cub, go to the Columbus, Ohio YouTube page. If you want to see the whole story up to 2017 in like documentary form, check out the Oregonians YouTube page. If you want to see what she's up to now, check out any of the Oregon Zoo's social media feeds, and I'm sure that you won't have to scroll too far to find a video of Nora.
Sounds like she's popular.
She's very popular.
We have a few questions coming in right now. One person asked, how can polar bears be depressed?
Well, that's a good question. And I get into this a little bit more deeply in the book. I mean, you don't want to anthropomorphize, and scientists don't know how animals experience emotion, but they know when they are exhibiting abnormal behaviors. And so, like I said, they call them stereotypic behaviors. These are when they do these repetitive motions over and over. There was a bear in New York, actually, named Gus, who got the nickname the bipolar bear because he spent 12 hours a day swimming the same figure-8 pattern in his enclosure. And they ended up bringing in a behavior specialist, and it turned out all he needed was more mental stimulation. And so they found ways. They got him new toys to play with. They got him toys. People with anxious dogs might be familiar with toys that have the food trapped inside that they have to kind of play with to get out. They would freeze fish inside of ice blocks so that he would have to spend time kind of tearing these ice blocks apart. And Nora was showing some of those same things. And they don't know whether they're, technically depressed in the human clinical sense of the word, but they know that they are exhibiting behaviors that are abnormal and are not signs of well-being.
I have another question coming in. Is it true polar bears are more vicious than grizzly bears?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you describe vicious. There's some folklore around about polar bears hunting human beings for sport. That is not true. They do not kill for recreation. They obviously have killed people before, and they are very large, dangerous, very strong, powerful animals. So, I think that they kind of get a bad rap for viciousness. I think polar bears and grizzly bears alike. I mean, they are not inherently violent in the human sense of the word. They are hunting to survive. It's the same way that, would it be considered vicious the way that we treat some of the animals we eat? Some people would probably say yes. But, they are not malicious in their intent, because I don't think that we can ascribe those types of motivations to animals. But they will kill you. I mean, that's for sure. But at the same time, if they don't have any reason to, they're not going to go out of their way to do so.
Yeah. Someone, I assume this is a yes, but someone asked, have you seen Nora? I imagine you've seen her a few times.
Yeah. I mean, in her most recently iteration here at the zoo, I have. She seems like she's doing well. I didn't really touch on this in the talk, but she had some skeletal issues as a very young cub while they were trying to figure out how to get her formula just right. And so she had what was described as metabolic bone disease, where she wasn't getting all of the nutrients for all of her bones to develop correctly. So she still walks with a little bit of a bow-legged stance, and she likely has some early onset arthritis, even though she's only about 6 years old now. But she seems, happy and healthy as far as you can tell with another species, especially a wild species who you can't exactly ask how they're doing.
Someone followed that question up with, do you know how Nora broke her leg?
They never figured it out. So when they did the surgery, because my first thought when I heard that she had broken her leg was that it probably had something to do with the skeletal issues she had as a cub. But they took a bone sample while they were doing that surgery, and they sent it off to a lab to analyze it. And apparently it was rock solid and had all the nutrients that it was supposed to. So, they're not really sure. She's a very rambunctious bear who liked to play a lot. And one of the things that she would do is she would come up to the glass and kind of slam her paws on the window. And so they think it could have been something like that. She was polar bears are rough and tumble animals, and she was a playful one, and so she may have just gotten her foot caught in on a log the wrong way. But they're not really ever going to know for sure.
We have another question. Are penguins equally in danger?
I'm not a penguin expert. I don't even know that I'm a polar bear expert, but I'm much more of a polar bear expert than I am a penguin expert. I don't believe that they are, because they don't rely on sea ice nearly as much as polar bears do. Polar bears need sea ice to hunt, whereas a penguin eats fish in the water and then can come up on land, whether it's frozen or not frozen. I'm sure there's a certain temperature threshold that they do not thrive above, but I don't think they are endangered in the same way that polar bears are.
We have another question. How long do polar bears live?
In the wild, usually about 15 to 20 years, and in zoos, they can live a bit longer than that. Like I said, Nanook was 29 when he passed away. Tossel was around the same age, but 25-ish is about the median lifespan for a captive polar bear.
There's a question about, do you see the polar bear species adapting or going extinct?
Well, neither really. To a certain extent, they probably cannot adapt quickly enough. I mean, they've adapted to that habitat up there over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. It's a little unclear exactly where they broke off of the genetic tree from grizzly bears, but it was at the very least tens of thousands of years ago. And over that time, they developed all these specialized adaptations to survive. The thick layer of fat, they have webbed feet, they have small ears and almost no tail to conserve heat, large paws, the ability to swim. To change all of those adaptations and to learn new ways to hunt in the time period that scientists believe the Arctic is going to be nearly ice-free just is not possible. I also don't think they're going to go completely extinct. There are going to be some places in the Arctic that continue to have sea ice, at least for the next 100 years, according to most estimates of how warm the Arctic is going to get. I think the most recent study I saw said that about 80% of bears would likely be extirpated. Like I said, there's 19 different subpopulations up there. And so maybe one or two of those subpopulations may continue to exist in the wild, depending on if and when we can get our act together in terms of carbon dioxide emissions.
Would you talk a little bit about the deadlines of 2030 and what we expect to see at that point, if we've been good or if we haven't been good, or if we've been proactive?
Yeah. So essentially, the report that came out in not this most recent climate conference, but the one before that, was essentially, if we want to keep our warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, above pre-industrial temperatures, then we need to essentially cut our carbon dioxide emissions by 45 to 50% by 2030. We are not on track to do that. And even with the somewhat modest agreements that came out of COP26 that just recently ended, we're still not on track to do that. And so we need more aggressive investment in renewables. And I talked a little bit about what our individual choices can do. And I think that individual choices are good, they're empowering, they are not enough. There needs to be systemic change on a global level, which, even just saying it, I'm like, oof, it's a mouthful. It's a tough thing to think about. But like I said, it's not most of us that are going to feel the worst effects of this. It's people like Gene, it's polar bears that live up in the Arctic. It's farmers in Africa who rely on rains that have been predictable for generations who are suffering through drought right now. It's the farmers in the southern part of the Willamette Valley where I live, who had a growing season that was a month shorter, who have wells that are running dry. I mean, the list is very long and depressing, but those are all the reasons why aggressive action is so important, not just on an individual level, but system-wide.
I don't know if this applies because most of your book tour has probably been virtual, but someone asked, when you're out on book tour, are you seeing people registering global warming as a reality?
It has been mostly virtual, and I think that the type of people who are going to come to a talk by someone like myself are probably inclined to believe in global warming. And I think that, you know, there's been a shift just even from when I started writing the book to now, that even some of the people who you would typically think of as climate deniers have been doing less denying. And it's more about, we recognize that it's a problem, but it's not that big of a problem. Or, you know, it's a problem, but, you know, the economic ramifications of tackling it are so great that we don't need to deal with it, or we can't deal with it, or it's just too big of a problem. And so, you know, I think that there's a whole section in the book on climate denial, because there's a little niche of climate deniers that focus specifically on polar bears, who argue that polar bears will be fine, that they will adapt, that, you know, they lived in warm climates thousands of years ago, so they'll be fine. But to get back to the original question, I think that the people who read this book and come to these kinds of talks are probably the choir that I am preaching to.
We had one question earlier, but I think you've answered it. It says, when creating this book, which storyline came first?
Yeah, I mean, it started with Nora.
Yeah.
You know, just because without her, I never would have tried to figure out where Nanook came from. I never would have met Jean or Gilbert and traveled up to Wales. So that she was really the seed that started it all. It really is the main character that carries the narrative through the book.
Well, I have come to the end of my questions, and if anyone has any other questions, someone's sending in a little note. It is so sad that we may lose polar bears due to the melting ice and more, which I'm sure everyone agrees with. But if we have no more questions, I think we'll let you go have your dinner. And we can just so appreciative that you did this today. And I want to show the people the cover again. Barrett Bookstore has them on their shelves, and thank the Darien Nature Center and all the friends of the library who made this possible tonight. And thank you, Kale, for staying with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and I appreciate everybody who tuned in.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.